Chapter 11 of The Canadians of Old by Philippe Aubert de Gaspé, translated by Sir Charles G.D. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. Madame d'Aberville's story. Saepe malem hoc nobis, si mens non laewa fuisset, de Coelho tactus memini praedicere quercus. Virgil. All was silence and gloom at d'Aberville Manor. The very servants went about their work with a spiritless air, far unlike their usual gaiety. Madame d'Aberville choked back her tears that she might not add to her husband's grief, and Blanche, for her mother's sake, did her weeping in secret. For in 3 days the vessel was to set sail. Captain d'Aberville had bidden his 2 friends, the priest and Monsieur d'Egmont, to meet Jules and Archie at a farewell dinner. At this meal every one strove to be cheerful, but the attempt was a conspicuous failure. The priest, wisely concluding that a sober conversation would be better than the sorrowful silence into which the party was continually dropping, introduced a subject which was beginning to press on all thoughtful minds. "Do you know, gentlemen," said he, "that a storm is gathering dark on the horizon of New France? The English are making tremendous preparations, and everything seems to indicate an early attack." "And then?" exclaimed Uncle Raoul. "Then whatever you like, my dear chevalier," answered the curé. "But it must be acknowledged that we have hardly forces enough at our command to long resist our powerful neighbors." "My dear abbé," exclaimed Uncle Raoul, "I think that in your reading this morning you must have stumbled on a chapter of the Lamentations of Jeremiah." "I might turn your weapon against yourself," retorted the priest, "by reminding you that those prophecies were fulfilled." "No matter," almost shouted Uncle Raoul, clinching his teeth. "The English, indeed! The English take Canada! By heaven, I would undertake to defend Quebec with my crutch. You forget, it seems, that we have always beaten the English, that we have beaten them against all odds, 5 to 1, 10 to 1, sometimes 20 to 1. The English, indeed!" "Concedo," said the curé, "I am ready to grant all you claim, and more too, if you like. But mark this, we grow weaker and weaker with every victory, while the enemy, thanks to the foresight of England, rises with new strength from each defeat. Meanwhile, France leaves us to our own resources." "Which shows," exclaimed Captain d'Aberville, "the faith our king reposes in our courage." "Meanwhile," interposed Monsieur d'Egmont, "he sends us so few soldiers that the colony grows weaker day by day." "Give us but plenty of powder and lead," answered the captain, "and 100 of my militia will do more in such a war as that which is coming upon us, a war of reconnoiterings, ambuscades, and surprises, than would 500 of the best soldiers of France. I speak from experience. For all that, however, we stand in great need of help from the mother country. Would that a few of those battalions which our beloved monarch pours into the north of Europe to fight the battles of Austria might be devoted to the defense of the colony." "You might rather wish," said the good gentleman, "that Louis XV. Had left Maria Theresa to fight it out with Prussia, and had paid a little more attention to New France." "It is perhaps hardly becoming in a young man like me," said Lochiel, "to mix myself up in your arguments. But to make up for my lack of experience, I will call history to my aid. Beware of the English. Beware of a government ever alive to the interests of its colonies, which it identifies with the interests of the empire. Beware of a nation which has the tenacity of the bulldog. If the conquest of Canada is necessary to her, she will never swerve from her purpose or count the sacrifice. Witness my unhappy country." "Bah!" cried Uncle Raoul, "the Scotch, indeed!" Lochiel began to laugh. "Gently, my dear Uncle Raoul," said the good gentleman. And to make use of your favorite maxim when you are collecting the rents, Let us render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. I have studied the history of Scotland, and I can assure you that neither in valor nor in patriotism need the Scotch yield place to any other nation, ancient or modern." "Oh, you see, I only wanted to tease this other nephew of mine," exclaimed Uncle Raoul, swelling his chest. "For we know a little history ourselves, thank God. No one knows better than Archie my esteem for his fellow countrymen, and my admiration for their dashing courage." "Yes, dear uncle, and I thank you for it," said Archie, grasping him by the hand. "But distrust the English profoundly, beware of their perseverance, and remember the delenda est Carthago of the Romans." "So much the better," said Jules. "I will be grateful to their perseverance if it brings me back to Canada with my regiment. May I do my first fighting against them here on this soil of Canada, which I love and which holds all that is dearest to me. You shall come with me, my brother, and shall take revenge in this new world for all that you have suffered in your own country." "With all my heart," cried Archie, grasping the handle of his knife as if it were the terrible claymore of the Camerons. "I will serve as a volunteer in your company if I cannot get a commission as an officer. And the simple soldier will be as proud of your exploits as if he had a hand in them himself." The young men warmed into excitement at the thought of heroic deeds. The great black eyes of Jules shot fire, and the old warlike ardor of the race suddenly flamed out in him. This spirit was infectious, and from all lips came the cry of "Vive le roi!" From the eyes of mother, sister, and aunt, in spite of all their efforts to restrain them, there escaped a few tears silently. The conversation became eager. Campaigns were planned, the English were beaten by sea and land, and Canada was set upon a pinnacle of splendor and prosperity. "Fill up your glasses," cried Captain d'Haberville, pouring himself out a bumper. "I am going to propose a health which everybody will drink with applause. Success to our arms, and may the glorious flag of the fleur-de-lis float forever over every fortress of New France." Just as they were raising the glasses to their lips, a terrific report was heard. It was like a stupendous clap of thunder, or as if some huge body had fallen upon the manor house, which shook to its very foundations. Every one rushed out of doors. The sun was shining with all the brilliance of a perfect day in July. They scaled the roof, but there was no sign anywhere that the house had been struck. Every one was stupefied with awe, the seigneur himself appearing particularly impressed. "Can it be," he exclaimed, "that this phenomenon presages the fall of my house?" In vain did M. d'Egmont, the priest, and Uncle Raoul endeavor to refer the phenomenon to ordinary causes. They could not remove the painful impression it had left. The glasses were left unemptied in the dining room, and the little company passed into the drawing room to take their coffee. What took place afterward only confirmed the d'Haberville family in their superstitious fears. Who knows, after all, whether such omens, to which the ancient world lent implicit belief, may not indeed be warnings from heaven when some great evil threatens us? If, indeed, we must reject all that our feeble reason comprehends not, we should speedily become Pyrrhonists, utter skeptics, like Moliere's Morphorius. Who knows? But one might write a whole chapter on this "who knows." The weather, which had been so fine all day, began to cloud up towards 6 o'clock in the evening. By 7 the rain fell in torrents, the thunder seemed to shatter the vault of heaven, and a great mass of rock, struck by a thunderbolt, fell from the bluff with terrific noise and obliterated the highway. Captain d'Haberville, who had carried on an immense deal of forest warfare along with his Indian allies, had become tinctured with many of their superstitions, and when the disasters of 1759 fell upon him, He was convinced that they had been foretold to him 2 years before. Jules, seated at supper between his mother and sister and holding their hands in his, shared in their depression. In order to turn their thoughts into another channel, he asked his mother to tell one of those stories with which she used to amuse his childhood. "It would give me," said he, "yet another memory of the tenderest of mothers to take with me to Europe." "I can refuse my boy nothing," said Madame d'Aberville, and she began the following story. A mother had an only child, a little girl, fair as a lily, whose great blue eyes wandered from her mother to heaven and back from heaven to her mother, only to fix themselves on heaven at last. How proud and happy was this loving mother when everyone praised the beauty of her child. Her cheeks like the rose just blown, her tresses fair and soft as the beaten flax, and falling over her shoulders in gracious waves. Immeasurably happy was this good mother. At last she lost the child she idolized, and, like Rachel, she would not be comforted. She passed her days in the cemetery, embracing the little grave. Mad with grief, she kept calling to the child with ceaseless pleadings. My darling, listen to your mother, who is come to carry you to your own bed, where you shall sleep so warmly. Oh, how cold you must be under the wet sod." She kept her ear close to the earth as if she expected a response. She trembled at every slightest noise, and sobbed to discover that it was but the murmur of the weeping willow moved by the breeze. The passers-by used to say, "This grass, so incessantly watered by her weeping, should be always green, but her tears are so bitter that they wither it, even like the fierce sun of midday after a heavy shower." She wept beside a brook where the little one had been accustomed to play with pebbles, and in whose pure stream she had so often washed the little feet. The passers-by used to say, "This mother sheds so many tears that she swells the current of the stream." She nursed her grief in every room wherein the little one had played. She opened the trunk in which she kept religiously all the child's belongings, its clothes, its playthings, the little gold-lined cup of silver from which she had last given it to drink. Passionately she kissed the little shoes, and her sobs would have melted a heart of steel. She went continually to the village church to pray, to implore God to work one miracle in her behalf and give her back her child. And the voice of God seemed to answer her. "Like David, you shall go to her, but she shall not return to you." Then she would cry, "When, Lord, when shall such joy be mine?" She threw herself down before the image of the Blessed Virgin, Our Lady of Sorrows, and it seemed to her that the eyes of the Madonna rested upon her sadly, and that she read in them these words: "Endure with patience, even as I have done, O daughter of Eve, till the day when your mourning shall be turned into gladness." And the unhappy mother cried anew, "But when will that blessed day come, O Mother of God?" One day the wretched mother, having prayed with more than her usual fervor, having shed, if possible, more tears than was her wont, fell asleep in the church, exhausted with her grief. The sexton shut the doors without noticing her. It must have been about midnight when she awoke. A ray of moonlight illuminating the altar revealed to her that she was yet in the church. Far from being terrified, she rather rejoiced at her situation, if such a thing as joy could be said to find any place in her sad heart. "Now," said she, "I can pray alone with God, alone with the Blessed Virgin, alone with myself." Just as she was going to kneel down, a low sound made her raise her head. She saw an old man who, entering by one of the side doors of the sacristy, made his way to the altar with a lighted taper in his hand. She saw with astonishment that it was the former sexton, dead 20 years before. She felt no fear at the sight, for every sentiment of her breast had been swallowed up in grief. The spectre climbed the altar steps, lighted the candles, and made the customary preparations for the celebration of a requiem mass. When he turned, she saw that his eyes were fixed and expressionless, like those of a statue. He re-entered the sacristy, but reappeared almost at once, followed this time by a venerable priest, bearing a chalice and clothed in full vestments. His great eyes, wide open, were filled with sadness. His movements were like those of an automaton. She recognized the old priest, 20 years dead, who had baptized her and given her her first communion. Far from being terrified by this marvel, the poor mother, wrapped up in her sorrow, concluded that her old friend had been touched by her despair and had broken the bonds of the sepulchre for her sake. All was somber, grim, and silent in this mass thus celebrated and ministered by the dead. The candles cast a feeble light like that of a dying lamp. At the moment when the bell of the Sanctus, striking with a dull sound as when a bone is broken by the gravedigger in some old cemetery, announced the descent of Christ upon the altar, the door of the sacristy opened anew and admitted a procession of little children, marching 2 and 2, who traversed the choir and filed into the space to the right of the altar. These children, the oldest of whom had had scarce 6 years of life upon earth, wore crowns of immortals, and carried in their hands, some of them baskets of flowers, some of them little vases of perfume, others cups of gold and silver filled with a transparent liquid. They stepped lightly, and a celestial rapture shone upon their faces. One only, a little girl at the end of the procession, appeared to follow the others painfully, loaded down as she was with 2 great jars which she could hardly drag. Her little feet, reddening under the pressure, were lifted heavily, and her crown of immortals seemed withered. The poor mother strove to reach out her arms, to utter a cry of joy on recognizing her own little one, but she found that she could neither move nor speak. She watched all the children file past her into the place to the left of the altar, and she recognized several who had but lately died. When her own child, bending under her burden, passed before her, she noticed that at every step the 2 jars besprinkled the floor with the water that filled them to the brim. When the little one's eyes met those of her mother, she saw in their depths a mingling of sadness, tenderness, and reproach. The poor woman strove to clasp her in her arms, but sight and consciousness alike fled from her. When she recovered from her swoon, the church was empty. In a monastery about a league from the village dwelt a monk who was renowned for his sanctity. This old man never left his cell, save to listen with sympathy to the bitter confessions of sinners or to succor the afflicted. To the first he said, "I know the corruptness of man's nature, so be not cast down. Come to me with confidence and courage every time you fall, and my arms shall ever be open to lift you up again." To the second he said, "Since God, who is so good, lays this burden upon you now, he is reserving you for infinite joys hereafter." To all he said, "If I should confess to you the story of my life, you would be astonished to behold in me a man who has been the sport of unbridled passion, and my misfortunes would melt you to tears." The poor mother threw herself sobbing at his feet and told him the marvelous thing she had seen. The compassionate old man, who had sounded the depths of the human heart, beheld here a favorable opportunity to set bounds to this excessive anguish. "My dear child," said he, "our overwrought imagination often cheats us with illusions which must be relegated to the realms of dream. Nevertheless, the Church teaches us that such marvels can really take place. It is not for us in our ignorance to set limit to the power of God. It is not for us to question the decrees of Him who took the worlds into His hand and launched them into space. I accept, then, the vision, and I will explain it to you. This priest, coming from the tomb to say a mass, doubtless obtained God's permission to fulfill part of his sacred ministry which he had left undone. And the sexton, by forgetfulness or negligence, was probably the cause of his omission. The children crowned with immortals are those who died with their baptismal grace unimpaired. They who carried baskets of flowers or vases of perfume are those whose mothers gave them up to God with holy resignation, comforted by the thought that they were exchanging this world of pain for the celestial country and the ineffable light about the throne. In the little cups of gold and silver were the tears of mothers who, though torn by the anguish of their loss, yet taught themselves to cry, "The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." On her knees, the poor mother drank in the old man's words. As Martha exclaimed at the feet of Christ, "Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. But I know that even now, whatever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it thee." Even so, the poor mother cried in her ardent faith, "If thou hadst been with me, my Father, my little one would not have died. But I know that even now, whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it thee." The good monk reflected a moment and prayed God for wisdom. It was a sentence of life or of death that he was about to pronounce upon this mother who appeared inconsolable. He was about to strike a blow which should either restore her to reason or break her heart forever. He took her hands in his withered and trembling clasp, and said gently, "You loved then this child whom you have lost?" "Loved her? My God, what a question!" And she threw herself moaning at his feet. Then, raising herself suddenly, she grasped the skirt of his cassock and besought him through her sobs, "You are a saint, my father. Oh, give me back my child, my darling." "Yes," said the monk, "you loved your little one. Doubtless you would have done much to spare her even the lightest grief?" "Anything, everything, my father!" exclaimed the poor woman. "I would have been rolled on the hot coals to spare her a little burn." "I believe you," said the monk. "And doubtless you love her yet?" "Do I love her? Merciful Heaven!" cried the wretched mother, springing to her feet as if bitten by a serpent. "I see, priest, that you know little of a mother's love if you imagine death can efface it." And trembling from head to foot, she burst again into a torrent of tears. "Begone, woman," said the old man, forcing himself to speak with sternness. "Begone, woman, who hast come to impose upon me. Begone, woman, who liest to God and to his priest. Thou hast seen thy little one staggering under the burden of thy tears, which she gathers drop by drop, and thou tellest me that thou lovest her? She is near thee now, toiling at her task, and thou sayest that thou lovest her? Begone, woman, for thou liest to God and to his minister." The eyes of the poor woman were opened, as if she were awaking from a frightful dream. She confessed that her grief had been insensate, and she besought the pardon of God. "Go in peace," said the old man. "Resign yourself to God's will, and the peace of God will be shed upon your soul." Some days after, she told the good monk that her little one, radiant with joy and carrying a basket of flowers, had appeared to her in a dream and thanked her for having ceased from her tears. The good woman, who was rich in this world's goods, devoted the rest of days and her substance to charity. To the children of the poor she gave most loving attention, and adopted several of them. When she died, they wrote upon her tomb, "Here lies the mother of the orphans." All were deeply moved by Madame d'Aberville's story, and some were even in tears. Jules embraced his mother and left the room to hide his emotion. "O God," he cried, "guard this life of mine, for if evil should befall me, my loving mother would be as inconsolable as the mother in the story she has just told us." A day or two later, Jules and Archie were tossing upon the Atlantic, and at the end of 2 months, after a prosperous voyage, they reached the shores of France. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Canadians of Old by Philippe Aubert de Gaspé, translated by Sir Charles G.D. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. The Burning of the South Shore. They came upon us in the night, and brake my bower, and slew my knight. My servant off our life did flee, and left us in the extremity. They slew my knight, to me so dear, they slew my knight and drove his gear. The moon may set, the sun may rise, but a deadly sleep has closed his eyes. Waverley. The trees were once more clothed in their wonted green after the passing of a northern winter. The woods and fields were enameled in 1,000 colors, and the birds were raising their cheerful voices to greet the spring of the year 1759. All nature smiled. Only man seemed sorrowful and cast down. And the laborer no more lifted his gay song, and the greater portion of the lands lay fallow for lack of hands to till them. A cloud hung over all New France, for the mother country, a veritable stepmother, had abandoned her Canadian children. Left to its own resources, the government had called to arms every able-bodied man to defend the colony against the invasion that menaced it. The English had made vast preparations. Their fleet, consisting of 20 ships of the line, 10 frigates, and 18 smaller vessels, accompanied by a number of transports, and carrying 18,000 men, was ascending the St. Lawrence under the command of General Wolfe, while 2 land armies, yet more numerous, were moving to effect a junction under the very walls of Quebec. The whole adult population of Canada, capable of bearing arms, had responded with ardor to their country's appeal, and there remained at home none but the old and feeble, the women and the children. To resist an army more numerous than the entire population of New France, the Canadians had little but the memory of past exploits, and of their glorious victory at Carillon in the preceding year. Of what avail their proved courage against an enemy so overpowering and sworn to their defeat? You have long been misunderstood, my brethren of old Canada. Most cruelly have you been slandered. Honor to them who have lifted your memory from the dust. Honor, 100 times honor, to our fellow countryman, Monsieur Garneau, who has rent the veil that covered your exploits. Shame to us who, instead of searching the ancient and glorious annals of our race, were content to bow before the reproach that we were a conquered people. Shame to us who were almost ashamed to call ourselves Canadians. Dreading to confess ourselves ignorant of the history of Assyrians, Medes, and Persians, that of our own country remained a sealed book to us. Within the last few years there has come a glorious reaction. Everyone sets his hand to the work, and the Canadian can now say, with Francis I, All is lost save honor. I am far from believing, however, that all is lost. The cession of Canada was, perhaps, a blessing in disguise, for the horrors of '93 failed to touch this fortunate colony which was protected by the flag of Britain. We have gathered new laurels, fighting beneath the banner of England, and twice has the colony been saved to England by the courage of her new subjects. In Parliament, at the bar, upon the field of battle, everywhere in his small sphere, the French Canadian has proved himself inferior to none. For a century have you struggled, O my countrymen, to preserve your nationality, and you behold it yet intact. The future perhaps holds for you another century of effort and struggle to guard it. Take heart and stand together, fellow countrymen. 2 detachments of the English army were disembarked at Rivière-Uelle at the beginning of June '59. Some of the habitants of the parish, concealed in the skirts of the wood, received them with a sharp fire and killed several men. The commander, exasperated at this loss, resolved to take signal vengeance. The 2 detachments ascended the river and encamped toward evening beside a brook which empties in Baie Sainte-Anne, southwest of where the college now stands. On the following morning, the commander ordered one of the companies to get ready to march, and summoning the lieutenant, gave him the following orders. Every house you come across belonging to these dogs of Frenchmen, set fire to it. I will follow you a little later. But, said the young officer, who was a Scotchman, must I burn the dwellings of those who offer no resistance? They say there is no one left in these houses except old men, women, and children. I think, sir, replied Major Montgomery, that my orders are quite clear. You will set fire to every house belonging to these dogs of Frenchmen. I had forgotten your weakness for our enemies. The young man bit his lips till they bled and marched his men away. The reader has doubtless recognized in this young man none other than Archie de Lochiel, who, having made his peace with the British government, had recovered possession of his estates and had obtained a lieutenancy in a regiment which he had himself recruited among the Highlanders of his own clan. Archie marched off, groaning and muttering all the curses he could think of in English, Gaelic, and French. At the first house where he stopped, a young woman flung herself weeping at his feet, crying piteously. "Good sir, do not kill my poor old father. Do not shorten his days. He has but a little while to live." A little boy, 11 or 12 years old, grasped him about the knees and exclaimed, "Mr. Englishman, do not kill grandpapa. If you only knew how good he is." "Do not fear," said Archie, entering the house. "I have no orders to kill old men, women, and children. They doubtless supposed," he added bitterly, "that I should meet none such on my route." Stretched on a bed of pain lay a decrepit old man. "I have been a soldier all my life, monsieur," said he. "I do not fear death, with whom I have been often face to face. But in the name of God, spare my daughter and her child." "They shall not be injured," replied Archie, with tears in his eyes. "But if you are a soldier, you know that a soldier has to obey orders. I am ordered to burn all the buildings on my line of march, and I have to obey. Whither shall we move you, father? Listen," he added, speaking close in the old man's ear. "Your grandson appears active and intelligent. Let him get a horse and hasten to warn your fellow countrymen that I have to burn down all the houses on my road. They will perhaps have time to save the most valuable of their belongings." "You are a good and brave young man," cried the old man. "If you were a Catholic, I would give you my blessing. But thank you 1,000 times. Thank you." "I am a Catholic," said Lochiel. The old man raised himself with difficulty, lifted his eyes toward heaven, spread his hands over Archie's bended head, and cried, "May God bless you for this act of humanity. In the day of heavy affliction, when you implore the pity of heaven, may God take count of your compassion toward your enemies and give ear to your prayers. Say to him then, with confidence in the sorest trials, I have the blessing of a dying old man, my enemy." The old man in his bed was hastily carried by the soldiers to an adjoining wood, and when he resumed his march, Lochiel had the satisfaction of seeing the little boy mounted on a swift horse and devouring the miles beneath him. Archie breathed more freely at the sight. The work of destruction went on, but from time to time, whenever he reached the top of a hill, Archie had the satisfaction of seeing old men, women, and children loaded down with their possessions, taking refuge in the neighboring woods. If he wept for their misfortunes, he rejoiced in his heart that he had done everything in his power to mitigate them. All the houses of a portion of Rivière-Huelle and of the parishes of Sainte-Anne and Saint-Roch along the edge of the St. Lawrence were by this time in ashes. Yet there came no order to cease from the work of destruction. From time to time, on the contrary, Lochiel saw the division of his superior officer, following in his rear, come to a halt on a piece of rising ground, doubtless for the purpose of permitting Major Montgomery to gloat over the results of his barbarous order. The first house of Saint-Jean-Port-Joli was that of a rich habitant, a sergeant in Captain d'Aberville's company. Frequently during his vacations had Archie lunched at this house with Jules and his sister. With what a pang he recalled the eager hospitality of these people. On their arrival, Mother Dupont and her daughters used to run to the dairy, the barn, the garden, for eggs, butter, cream, parsley, and chervil, to make them pancakes and herb omelettes. Father Dupont and his sons would hasten to put up the horses and give them a generous measure of oats. While Mother Dupont was preparing the meal, the young people would make a hasty toilet. Then they would get up a dance and skip merrily to the notes of the violin which screeched beneath the old sergeant's bow. In spite of the remonstrances of Blanche, Jules would turn everything upside down and tease everybody to death. He would snatch the frying pan from the hands of Mother Dupont, throw his arm around her waist, and compel her, in spite of her struggles, to dance with him. And these good people would shout with laughter till one would think they could never get too much of the racket. All these things Lochiel went over in the bitterness of his soul, and a cold sweat broke out on his brow as he ordered the burning of this hospitable home. Almost all the houses in the first concession of Saint-Jean-Port-Joli were by this time in ruins, yet there came no order to desist. About sunset, however, coming to the little river Port-Joli, a few arpents from the d'Aberville place, Lochiel took it upon himself to halt his company. He climbed the hillside, and there, in sight of the manor, he waited. He waited like a criminal upon the scaffold, hoping against hope that a reprieve may come at the last moment. His heart was big with tender memories as he gazed upon the dwelling where for 10 years the exiled orphan had been received as a child of the house. Sorrowfully he looked down on the silent village which had been so full of life when last he saw it. Some pigeons, fluttering over the buildings and from time to time alighting on the roofs, appeared to be the only living creatures about the manor. Sighing, he repeated the words of Ossian. "Selma, thy halls are silent. There is no sound in the woods of Morven. The wave tumbles alone in the coast. The silent beam of the sun is on the field." "Oh oui, mes amis," cried Lochiel in the language that he loved. "Vos salons sont maintenant, et là, désert et silencieux. There is no sound upon this hill which so lately was echoing your bright voices. I hear only the ripples lapping upon the sand. One pale ray from the setting sun is all that lights your meadows. What shall I do, kind heaven, if the rage of the brute who commands me is not yet sated? Should I refuse to obey him? Then am I dishonored. A soldier cannot in time of war refuse to carry out the orders of his commander. This brute could have me shot upon the spot, and the shield of the Camerons would be forever tarnished. Who would trouble himself to see that justice was done to the memory of the soldier who chose death rather than the stain of ingratitude? On the contrary, that which was with me but an emotion of grateful remembrance would certainly be imputed to me for treason by this creature who hounds me with his devilish malice." The harsh voice of Major Montgomery put an end to these reflections. "What are you doing here?" he growled. "I have left my men by the edge of the river, and was proposing to encamp there after our long march." "It is not late," answered the major, "and you know the country better than I. You will easily find for your encampment another place than that which I have just chosen for myself." "I will march at once," said Archie. "There is another river about a mile from here where we can camp for the night." "Very well," said Montgomery in an insolent voice, "and as you have but a few more houses to burn in this district, your men will soon be able to rest." "It is true," said Lochiel, "for there remain but 5 more dwellings. 2 of these, however, the group of buildings which you see yonder, and a mill on the stream where I am going to camp, belong to the Seigneur d'Aberville, the man who, during my exile, took me in and treated me as a son. For God's sake, Major Montgomery, give the order yourself for their destruction." "I should never have believed," replied the major, "that a British officer would have dared to utter treason." "You forget, sir," said Archie, restraining himself with difficulty, "that I was then a mere child. But once more I implore you, in the name of all you hold most dear, give the order yourself, and do not force upon me the dishonor of setting the torch to the home of them who in my days of adversity heaped me with benefits." "I understand," replied the major with a sneer. "You wish to keep a way open to return to the favor of your friends when occasion shall arise." At this insulting sarcasm Archie was tempted for an instant to draw his claymore and cry, "If you are not as cowardly as you are insolent, defend yourself, Major Montgomery." Happily reason came to his aid. Instead of grasping his sword, his hand directed itself mechanically toward his breast, which he tore fiercely. Then he remembered the words of the witch. "Keep your pity for yourself, Archibald de Lochiel. When, forced to execute a barbarous order, your nails shall tear that breast which covers, nevertheless, a noble heart." "She was indeed taught of hell, that woman," thought he, "when she uttered that prophecy to a Cameron of Lochiel." With malicious pleasure Montgomery watched, for a moment, the strife of passions which tortured the young man's heart. He gloated over his despair. Then, persuaded that Archie would refuse to obey, he turned his back upon him. Lochiel, perceiving his treacherous design, hastened to rejoin his men, and a half-hour later the buildings were in flames. Archie paused beside the fountain where in happier days he had so often refreshed himself with his friends, and from that spot his lynx-like eyes discerned Montgomery, who had returned to the hilltop, and there with folded arms stood feasting on the cruel scene. Foaming with rage at the sight of his enemy, Archie cried, You have a good memory, Montgomery. You have not forgotten the time when my ancestor beat your grandfather with the flat of his sabre in an Edinburgh tavern. But I also have a good memory. I shall not always wear this uniform that now ties my hands, and sooner or later I will redouble the dose upon your own shoulders, for you would be too much of a coward to meet me in a fair fight. A beast like you cannot possess even the one virtue of courage. Curse be you and all your race. When you come to die, may you be less fortunate than those whose dwellings you have desolated today, and may you have no place to lay your head. May all the pangs of hell. Then, ashamed of the impotence of his rage, he moved away with a groan. The mill upon the Trois Saumons River was soon but a heap of cinders, and the burning of Captain d'Aberville's property in Quebec, which took place during the siege, was all that was needed to complete his ruin. After taking the necessary precautions for the safety of his company, Archie directed his steps to the desolated manor. There, seated on the summit of the bluff, he gazed in the silence of anguish on the smoking ruins at his feet. It must have been about 9 o'clock. The night was dark, and few stars revealed themselves in the sky. Presently, however, he made out a living creature wandering among the ruins. It was old Niger, who lifted his head toward the bluff and began howling piteously. Archie thought the faithful animal was reproaching him with his ingratitude, and bitter tears scalded his cheeks. "Behold," said he, "the fruits of what we call the code of honor of civilized nations. Are these the fruits of Christianity, that religion of compassion which teaches us to love even our enemies? If my commander were one of these savage chiefs, whom we treat as barbarians, and I had said to him, 'Spare this house, for it belongs to my friends. I was a wanderer and a fugitive, and they took me in and gave me a father and a brother,' the Indian chief would have answered, 'It is well. Spare your friends. It is only the viper that stings the bosom that has warmed it.' I have always lived in the hope," went on Lochiel, "of one day rejoining my Canadian friends, whom I love today more than ever, if that were possible. No reconciliation would have been required. It was natural that I should seek to regain my patrimony, so nearly dissipated by the confiscations of the British government. There remained to me no career but the army, the only one worthy of a Cameron. I had recovered my father's sword, which one of my friends had bought back from among the spoils of Culloden. Bearing this blade, which had never known a stain, I dreamed of a glorious career. I was grieved indeed when I learned that my regiment was to be sent against New France. But a soldier could not resign in time of war without disgrace. My friends would have understood that. But what hope now for the ingrate who has ravaged the hearth of his benefactors? Jules d'Aberville, whom I once called my brother, his gentle and saintly mother, who took me to her heart, the fair girl whom I called my sister, to hide a deeper feeling, these will, perhaps, hear my justification and end by forgiving me. But Captain d'Aberville, who loves with all his heart, but who never forgives an injury, can it be imagined that he will permit his family to utter my name unless to curse it? But I am a coward and a fool," continued Archie, grinding his teeth. "I should have declared before my men my reasons for refusing to obey, and though Montgomery had had me shot upon the spot, there would have been found loyal spirits to approve my refusal and to right my memory. I have been a coward and a fool. For in case the major, instead of having me shot, had tried me before a court-martial, even while pronouncing my death sentence, They would have appreciated my motives. I would have been eloquent in the defense of my honor and of that noblest of human sentiments, gratitude. Oh, my friends, would that you could see my remorse. Coward, 10,000 times coward. A voice near him repeated the words, coward, 10,000 times coward. He thought at first it was the echo from the bluff. He raised his head and perceived the witch of the manor, standing erect on a projecting rock. She stretched out her hands over the ruins and cried, woe, woe, woe. Then she descended like lightning by a steep and dangerous path, and wandered to and fro among the ruins, crying, desolation, desolation, desolation. At length she raised her arm with a gesture of menace, pointed to the summit of the bluff, and cried in a loud voice, woe to you, Archibald de Lochiel. The old dog howled long and plaintively. Then silence fell upon the scene. Archie's head sank upon his breast. The next moment, 4 savages sprang upon him, hurled him to the ground, and bound his hands. These were 4 warriors of the Abénaquis, who had been spying upon the movements of the English ever since their landing at Rivière-Uelle. Relying upon his tremendous strength, Archie made desperate efforts to break his bonds. The tough moose hide which enwound his wrists in triple coils stretched mightily, but resisted all his efforts. Seeing this, Archie resigned himself to his fate and followed his captors quietly into the forest. His vigorous Scottish legs spared him further ill-treatment. Bitter were the reflections of the captive during the rapid southward march through the forest wherein he had so often hunted with his brother d'Aberville. Heedless of the fierce delight of the Indians, whose eyes flashed at the sight of his despair, he exclaimed, "You have conquered, Montgomery. My curses recoil upon my own head. You will proclaim that I have deserted to the enemy, that I am a traitor as you long suspected. You will rejoice indeed, for I have lost all, even honor." And, like Job, he cursed the day that he was born. After 2 hours' rapid marching, they arrived at the foot of the mountain which overlooks Trois Saumons Lake, on which water Archie concluded that they would find an encampment of the Abénaquis. Coming to the edge of the lake, one of his captors uttered 3 times the cry of the osprey, and the 7 echoes of the mountain repeated, each 3 times, the piercing and strident call of the great swan of Lower Canada. At any other time, Lochiel would have thrilled with admiration at the sight of this beautiful water outspread beneath the starlight, enringed with mountains and seeded with green-crowned islets. It was the same lake to which, for 10 happy years, he had made hunting and fishing excursions with his friends. It was the same lake which he had swum at its widest part to prove his prowess. But tonight all nature appeared as dead as the heart within him. From one of the islets came a birch canoe, paddled by a man in Indian garb, but wearing a cap of fox skin. The newcomer held a long conversation with the 4 savages, but Archie was ignorant of the Abénaquis tongue and could make out nothing of what they said. 2 of the Indians thereupon started off to the southwest, but Archie was put into the canoe and taken to the islet. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Canadians of Old by Philippe Aubert de Gaspé, translated by Sir Charles G.D. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. A Night Among the Savages. What tragic tears bedew the eye, what deaths we suffer ere we die. Our broken friendships we deplore, and loves of youth that are no more. Logan. All on earth is shadow, all beyond is substance. The reverse is folly's creed. How solid all where change shall be no more. Young's Night Thoughts. Having cursed his enemy and the day of his birth, Lochiel had gradually come to a more Christian frame of mind as he lay bound to a tree and all hope banished from his heart. He knew that the savages scarcely ever spared their captives, and that a slow and hideous death was in store for him. Recovering his natural force of mind, he hardly took care to pray for his deliverance, but he implored of heaven forgiveness for his sins and strength to bear the tortures that were before him. Of what account, thought he, the judgment of men when the dream of life is over? And he bowed himself beneath the hand of God. The three warriors were seated around within a dozen feet of Lochiel, smoking in silence. The Indians are naturally reserved, regarding light conversation as only suitable to women and children. One of them, however, by name Talamousse, speaking to the man of the island, made inquiry. "Will my brother wait long here for the warriors from the portage?" 3 days, answered the latter, lifting up 3 fingers. Grand Loutre and Talamousse will depart to-morrow with the prisoner. The Frenchmen will rejoin them at the encampment of Captain Launière. "It is well," said Grand Loutre, extending his hand toward the south. "We are going to take the prisoner to the camp at Petit Marigot, where we will wait 3 days for my brother and the warriors from the portage, and then go to the camp of Captain Launière." For the first time, Lochiel perceived that the voice of the man with the fox-skin cap was not like that of the other 2 men, although he spoke their language fluently. Hitherto he had suffered in silence the torments of a burning thirst. It was a veritable torture of Tantalus, with the crystal lake waters lapping at his feet. But under the impression that the man might be a Frenchman, he made bold to say, "If there is a Christian among you, for God's sake, let him give me a drink." "What does the dog want?" said Grand Loutre to his companion. The man addressed made no answer for some moments. His whole body trembled, his face became pale as death, a cold sweat bathed his forehead. Then, controlling himself sternly, he answered in his natural voice, "The prisoner asks for a drink." "Tell the dog of an Englishman," said Talamousse, "that he shall be burned to-morrow, and that if he is very thirsty he shall have boiling water to drink." "I am going to tell him," replied the Canadian presently, "that my brothers permit me to give their captive a little water." "Let my brother do as he will," said Talamousse. "The pale-faces have hearts like young girls." The Canadian curled a piece of birch bark into the form of a cup, filled it with fresh water, and handed it to the prisoner, saying, "Who are you, sir? In the name of God, who are you? Your voice is like that of a man who is very dear to me." "I am Archibald Cameron of Lochiel," came the answer. "Once the friend of your countrymen, now their enemy, and well deserving the fate which is in store for him." "Mr. Archie," replied Dumais, for he it was, "although you had slain my brother, although it should be necessary for me to cut down these 2 red rascals with my tomahawk, in an hour you shall be free. I shall try persuasion before resorting to violent measures. Now, silence." Dumais resumed his place with the Indians, and after a time he remarked, "The prisoner thanks the redskins for promising him the death of a man. He says that the song of the paleface will be that of a warrior." "Hurrah!" said Grand Loutre. "The Englishman will screech like an owl when he sees the fires of our wigwams." And he went on smoking and casting glances of contempt upon Lochiel. "The Englishman," said Talamousse, "speaks like a man while the stake is yet far off. The Englishman is a coward who could not suffer thirst. He has begged his enemies for a drink, like a baby crying for its mother." And the Indian spit upon the ground contemptuously. Dumais opened a wallet, took out some provisions, and offered a portion to the savages, who refused to eat. Then he stepped into the woods, and after a short search brought out a bottle of brandy. He took a drink and began to eat. The eyes of one of the Indians dwelt longingly on the bottle. "Talamousse is not hungry, my brother," said he, "but he is very thirsty. He has made a long march today, and he is very tired. The fire-water is good to rest one's legs." Dumais passed him the bottle. The Indian seized it with a trembling hand and gulped down a good half of the contents. "Ah, but that's good," said he, handing back the bottle, and presently his piercing eyes grew glazed, and a vacant look began to creep into his face. "Dumais does not offer any to his brother Grand Loutre," said the Canadian. "He knows that he does not drink fire-water." "The Great Spirit loves Grand Loutre," said the latter, "and made him throw up the only mouthful of fire-water he ever drank. The Great Spirit made him so sick that he thought he was going to visit the country of souls. Grand Loutre is very thankful, for the fire-water takes away man's wisdom." "It is good fire-water," said Talamousse, after a moment's silence, stretching out his hand toward the bottle, which Dumais removed from his reach. "Give me one more drink, my brother, I beg you." "No," said Dumais, "not now. By and by, perhaps." And he put the bottle back into his knapsack. "The Great Spirit also loves the Canadian," resumed Dumais after a pause. "He appeared to him last night in a dream." "What did he say to my brother?" asked the Indians. "The Great Spirit told him to buy back the prisoner," answered Dumais. "My brother lies like a Frenchman," replied Grand Loutre. "He lies like all the pale-faces. The redskins do not lie to them." "The French never lie when they speak of the Great Spirit," said the Canadian, and opening his knapsack, he took a small sip of brandy. "Give me, my brother, give me one little drink," said Talamousse, stretching out his hand. "If Talamousse will sell me his share of the prisoner," said Dumais, "he shall have another drink." "Give me all the fire-water," said Talamousse, "and take my share of the English dog." "No," said Dumais, "one more drink, and that will be all." And he made a movement to put away the bottle. "Give it to me then, and take my share of him." He seized the bottle in both hands, took a long pull at the precious fluid, and then fell asleep on the grass. "There's one of them fixed," thought Dumais. Grand Loutre had been watching all this with an air of defiance, but had kept on smoking indifferently. "Now, will my brother sell me his share of the prisoner?" asked Dumais. "What do you want of him?" replied the savage. "To sell him to Captain d'Haberville, who will have him hung for burning his house. The prisoner will endure like a warrior the tortures of the stake, but at the sight of the rope he will weep like a girl." "My brother lies again," replied Grand Loutre. "All the English that we have burned cried out like cowards, and not one of them sang his death song like a man. They would have thanked us to hang them. It is only the red warrior who prefers the stake to the disgrace of being hung like a dog." "Let my brother heed my words," said Dumais. "The prisoner is not an Englishman, but a Scotchman, and the Scotch are the savages of the English. Let my brother observe the prisoner's clothing, and see how like it is to that of a savage warrior." "That is true," said Grand Loutre. "He does not smother himself in clothes like the other soldiers whom the great Ononthio sends across the water. But what has that to do with it?" "Why," replied the Canadian, "a Scotch warrior would rather be burned than be hung. Like the redskins of Canada, he considers that one hangs only dogs, and that if he were to go to the country of souls with the rope about his neck, the savage warriors would refuse to hunt with him." "My brother lies again," said the Indian, shaking his head incredulously. "The Scotch savages are nevertheless pale-faces, and they cannot have the courage to endure pain like a redskin." And he went on smoking thoughtfully. "Let my brother hearken, and he will see that I speak the truth," said Dumais. "Speak. Thy brother gives ear." "The English and the Scotch," continued the Canadian, "dwell in a great island beyond the great water. The English dwell on the plains, while the Scotch inhabit the mountains. The English are as many as the grains of sand about the shores of this lake, while the Scotch are but as the sands of this little island. Yet the Scotch have withstood the English in war for as many moons as there are leaves on this great maple. The English are rich, the Scotch poor. When the Scotch beat the English, they return to their mountains laden with booty. When the English beat the Scotch, they get nothing. The profit is all on one side." "If the English are so numerous," said Grand Loutre, "why do they not pursue their enemies into the mountains and kill every man of them? They could not escape, since, as my brother says, they live on the same island." "Hurrah!" cried Dumais, after the fashion of the savages. "I will show my brother why. The Scotch mountains are so high that if an army of young Englishmen were to ascend them but halfway, they would be an army of graybeards before they got down again." "The French are always tomfools," said the Indian. "They can't do anything but talk nonsense. Soon they will put on petticoats and go and sit with our squaws and amuse them with their funny stories. They never talk seriously like men." "My brother ought to understand," said Dumais, "that what I said was merely to impress upon him the remarkable height of the Scottish mountains." "Let my brother continue. Grand Loutre hears and understands," said the Indian, accustomed to this figurative style of speech. "The Scotch legs are as strong as those of a moose and active as those of a roebuck," continued Dumais. "True," said the Indian, "if they are all like the prisoner here, who, in spite of his bonds, kept right on my heels all the way. He has the legs of an Indian." "The English," said Dumais, "are large and strong, but they have soft legs and huge bellies. When they pursue their more active enemies into the mountains, the Scotchmen lie in ambush and kill them by the score. The war seemed as if it would last forever. When the English took prisoners, they used to burn many of them, but these would sing their death song at the stake, and heap insult on their torturers by telling them that they had drunk out of the skulls of their ancestors." "Hurrah!" cried Grand Loutre. "They are men, these Scotch." "The Scotch had a great chief named Wallace, a mighty warrior. When he set out for war, the earth trembled under his feet. He was as tall as yonder fir tree and as strong as an army. An accursed wretch betrayed him for money. He was taken prisoner and sentenced to be hung. At this news, a cry of rage and grief went up from all the mountains of Scotland. All the warriors painted their faces black. A great council was held, and 10 chiefs, bearing the pipe of peace, set out for England. They were conducted into a great wigwam. The council fire was lighted, and for a long time everyone smoked in silence. At length an old chief took up the word and said, "My brother, the earth has drunk enough of the blood of these 2 great nations, and we wish to bury the hatchet. Give us back Wallace, and we will remain hostages in his place. You shall put us to death if ever again he lifts the tomahawk against you." With these words he handed the pipe of peace to the great Onontio of the English, who waved it aside, saying sternly, "Within 3 days Wallace shall be hung." Listen, my brother, said the great Scotch chief. If Wallace must die, let him die the death of a warrior. Hanging is a death for dogs. And again he presented the pipe of peace, and Ononthio refused it. The deputies withdrew and consulted together. On their return, the great chief said, "Let my brother hearken favorably to my last words. Let him fix 11 stakes to burn Wallace and these 10 warriors, who will be proud to share his fate and will thank their brother for his clemency." Once more he offered the pipe of peace, and once more Ononthio rejected it. "Hurrah!" cried Grand Loutre. "Those were noble and generous words. But my brother has not told me how the Scotch are now friends with the English and fighting against the French." With rage in their hearts, the deputies returned to their mountains. At their death cries, which they uttered at the gate of every town and village to announce the fate of Wallace, everyone rushed to arms, and the war between the two nations continued for as many moons as there are grains of sand here in my hand, said Dumais, picking up a handful. The Scotch were generally beaten by their swarming enemies, and their rivers ran with blood, but they knew not how to yield. The war would have been going on still, but for a traitor who warned the English that 9 Scotch chiefs, having gathered in a cavern to drink fire-water, had fallen to sleep there, like our brother Talamousse. "The Redskins," said Grand Loutre, "are never traitors to their own people. They deceive their enemies, but never their friends. Will my brother tell me how it comes that there are traitors among the pale faces?" Dumais, a little puzzled to answer this question, went on as if he had not heard it. "The 9 chiefs were taken to a great city and condemned to be hung within a month. On this sad news, fires were lighted on all the hills of Scotland to summon a grand council of all the warriors. The wise men spoke fine words for 3 days and 3 nights, but came to no conclusion. Then they consulted the spirits, and a great medicine man declared that the Manitou was angry with his children, and that they must bury the hatchet forever. 20 warriors with blackened faces betook themselves to the chief town of the English, and before the gates they uttered a death cry for every captive chief. A great council was held, and Ononthio granted peace on condition that they should give hostages, that they should deliver up their strongholds, that the 2 nations should henceforth be as one, and that the English and Scotch warriors should fight shoulder to shoulder against the enemies of the great Ononthio. A feast was made which lasted 3 days and 3 nights, and at which so much brandy was drunk that the women took away all the tomahawks. Had they not done so, the war would have broken out anew. The English were so rejoiced that they promised to send the Scotch all the heads, feet, and tails of the sheep which they should kill in the future. "The English must be generous, indeed," said the Indian. "My brother must see by this," continued Dumais, "that a Scotch warrior would rather be burned than hung. And he will sell me his share of the prisoner. Let my brother fix his price, and Dumais will not count the cost." "Grand Loutre will not sell his share of the prisoner," said the Indian. "He has promised Taoutsi and Katakoui to hand him over to-morrow at Petit Marigot, and he will keep his word. The council will be assembled, and Grand Loutre will speak to the young men. If the young men consent not to burn him, it will then be time to hand him over to d'Haberville." "My brother knows Dumais," said the Canadian. "He knows that he is rich and a man of his word. Dumais will pay for the prisoner 6 times as much as Ononthio pays the Indians for every one of his enemies' scalps." "Grand Loutre knows," said the Indian, "that his brother speaks the truth, but he will not sell his share of the prisoner." The eyes of the Canadian shot flame, and instinctively he grasped his hatchet, but suddenly changing his mind, he assumed an indifferent air and knocked the ashes out of the bowl of his tomahawk, which served the Canadians as well as the savages for tobacco pipe when on the march. Although the first hostile movement of the Canadian had not escaped the keen eye of his companion, the latter went on smoking tranquilly. The words of Dumais had revived the spark of hope in Archie's heart. In spite of his bitter remorse, he was too young to bid farewell without regret to all that made life dear. Could he, the last of his race, willingly suffer the shield of the Camerons to go to the tomb with a stain? Could he endure to die, leaving the d'Habervilles to think that they had cherished a viper in their bosom? He thought of the despair of Jules, the curses of the implacable captain, the silent grief of the good woman who used to call him her son, the sorrow of the fair girl whom he had hoped one day to call by a tenderer name than that of sister. Archie was indeed young to die, and with the renewal of hope in his heart, he again clung desperately to life. He had followed with ever-increasing anxiety the scene that was passing before him. He endeavored to comprehend it by watching the faces of the speakers. Dark as was the night, he had lost nothing of the hate and scorn which were flashed upon him from the cruel eyes of the savages. Knowing the ferocity of the Indians when under the influence of alcohol, it was not without surprise he saw Dumais passing them the bottle. But when he saw one refuse to drink and the other stretched in drunken stupor on the sand, he understood the Canadian's tactics. When he heard the name of Wallace, he remembered that during Dumais's illness he had often entertained him with fabulous stories about his favorite hero. But he was puzzled to guess the Canadian's purpose in talking about the deeds of a Scottish warrior. If he had understood the latter part of Dumais's story, he would have recalled the chaffing of Jules in regard to the pretended delicacies of his countrymen. When he saw the angry gleam in the Canadian's eyes, when he saw him grasp his tomahawk, he was on the point of crying not to strike. His generous soul foresaw the dangers to which his friend would be exposed if he should kill an Indian belonging to a tribe allied with the French. The Canadian was silent for some time. He refilled his pipe, began to smoke, and at length said quietly, "When Grand Loutre, with his father, his wife, and his 2 sons, fell sick of the smallpox over by South River, Dumais sought them out. At the risk of bringing the disease upon himself and family, he carried them to his own wigwam, where he nursed them for 3 moons. It was not the fault of Dumais if the old man and the 2 boys died. Dumais had them buried like Christians, and the Black Robe has prayed to the Great Spirit for their souls." "If Dumais," replied the Indian, "if Dumais and his wife and his children had fallen sick in the forest, Grand Loutre would have carried them to his wigwam, would have fished for them and would have hunted for them, would have bought them the fire water which is the Frenchman's medicine, and would have said, 'Eat and drink, my brothers, and recover your strength.' Grand Loutre and his squaw would have watched day and night by the couch of their French friends, and never would Grand Loutre have said, 'Remember that I fed you and took care of you and bought fire water for you with my furs.' Let my brother take the prisoner," continued the Indian, drawing himself up proudly. "The redskin is no longer in debt to the paleface." And he calmly resumed his smoking. "Listen, my brother," said the Canadian, "and pardon Dumais that he has hidden the truth. He knew not thy great heart. Now he is going to speak in the presence of the Great Spirit himself, in whose presence he dare not lie." "That is true," said the Indian. "Let my brother speak." "When Grand Loutre was sick, 2 years ago," continued the Canadian. Dumais told him about his adventure when the ice went out that spring at the Falls of St. Thomas, and how he was saved by a young Scotchman who had arrived that very evening at the house of the Seigneur de Beaumont. "My brother has told me," said the Indian, "and he has shown me the little island suspended over the abyss, whereon he awaited death. Grand Loutre knew the place and the old cedar to which my brother clung." "Very well," replied Dumais, rising and taking off his cap. "Thy brother swears in the presence of the Great Spirit that the prisoner is none other than the young Scotchman who saved his life." The Indian gave a great cry which went echoing wildly round the lake. He sprang to his feet, drew his knife, and rushed upon the captive. Lochiel thought his hour had come and commended his soul to God. What was his surprise when the savage cut his bonds, grasped his hands with every mark of delight, and pushed him into the arms of his friend. Dumais pressed Archie to his breast, then sank upon his knees and cried, "I have prayed to thee, O God, to extend the right arm of your protection over this noble and generous man. My wife and my children have never ceased to make the same prayer. I thank thee, O God, that thou hast granted me even more than I had dared to ask. I thank thee, O God, for I should have committed a crime to save his life, and should have gone to my grave a murderer." "Now," said Lochiel, after endeavoring to thank his rescuer, "let us get off as quickly as possible, my dear Dumais, for if my absence from camp is perceived, I am ruined utterly. I will explain as we go." Just as they were setting foot in the canoe, the cry of the osprey was heard 3 times from the lake shore opposite the island. "It is the young men from Marigot coming to look for you, my brother," said Grand Loutre, turning to Lochiel. "Taoutsi and Katakouis must have met some of them and told them they had an English prisoner on the island. But they will shout a long time without awakening Talamousse. And as to Grand Loutre, he is going to sleep till the Canadian gets back. Bon voyage, my brothers." As Archie and his companion directed their course toward the north, they heard for a long time the cries of the osprey, which were uttered at short intervals by the Indians on the south shore. "I fear," said Archie, "that the young Abénaquais warriors, foiled in their amiable intent, will make a bad quarter of an hour for our friends on the island." "It is true," replied his companion, "that we are depriving them of a very great pleasure. They find the time long at Marigot, and to-morrow might have been passed very pleasantly in roasting a prisoner." Lochiel shuddered in spite of himself. "As for the 2 Kanauas, red rascals, we have left, do not trouble yourself for them. They will know how to get out of the scrape. The Indian is the most independent being imaginable, and renders account to nobody for his actions unless it suits him. Moreover, the worst that could happen to them in the present instance would be, using their own expression, to cover the half of the prisoner with beaver skins or their equivalent. In other words, to pay their share in him to Taoutsi and Katakouis. It is more probable, however, that Grand Loutre, who is a kind of a wag among them, would choose rather to raise a laugh at the expense of his 2 disappointed comrades, for he is never without resource. He will say, perhaps, that Talamousse and he had a perfect right to dispose of their half of the prisoner, that the half which they had set free had run away with the other half, that they had better hurry after him, for the prisoner was loaded with their share of himself, and therefore could not travel very fast, with other waggery that would be hugely relished by the Indians. It is more probable, however, that he will speak to them of my adventure at the Falls of St. Thomas, which the Abénaquis know about, and will tell them that it was to your devotion I owed my life. Then, as the Indians never forget a good turn, they will cry, 'Our brothers have done well to set free the savior of our friend the paleface.'" Lochiel wished to enter into full details in order to excuse himself, in the eyes of Dumais, for his cruel conduct on the day preceding, but the latter stopped him. "A man like you, sir," said the Canadian, "need make me no explanation. I could hardly suspect a heart so noble and so self-forgetful of failing at all in the sentiments of humanity and gratitude. I am a soldier, and I know all the duties imposed upon one by military discipline. I have assisted at hideous performances on the part of our barbarous allies, which in my position as sergeant I might have been able to prevent, had not my hands been tied by the orders of my superiors. It is a hard calling for sympathetic hearts, this profession of ours. I have been witness of a spectacle," continued Dumais, "which makes me shudder now when I think of it. I have seen these barbarians burn an English woman. She was a young woman of great beauty. I still see her tied to the stake, where they tortured her for 8 mortal hours. I still see her in the midst of her butchers, clothed, like our first mother, in nothing but her long fair hair. I shall hear forever her heart-rending cry of 'My God, my God!' We did all we could to buy her back, but in vain. For her father, her husband, and her brothers, in defending her with the courage of despair, had killed many of the savages, and among them 2 of their chiefs. We were but 15 Canadians against at least 200 Indians. I was young then, and I wept like a child. Ducrot, who was nicknamed the Terror, foamed with rage and cried to Francœur, 'What, sergeant, shall we, who are men and Frenchmen, let them burn a poor woman before our eyes? Give the order, sergeant, and I will split the skulls of 10 of these red hounds before they have time to defend themselves.' And he would have done it, for he was a mighty man, was the Terror, and quick as a fish. Black Bear, one of their greatest warriors, approached us with a sneer. Ducrot sprang toward him, with his tomahawk uplifted, crying, 'Take your hatchet, coward, and you shall see that you have no woman to deal with.' The Indian shrugged his shoulders with an air of pity, and said slowly, 'The paleface is childish. He would kill his friend to defend the squaw of a dog of an Englishman, his enemy.' The sergeant put an end to the argument by ordering Ducrot back into the ranks. He was a brave and generous heart, this sergeant, as his name attested. With tears in his eyes, he said to us, 'It would be useless for me to disobey my orders. We would all be massacred without doing the poor woman any good. What would be the consequence? The great tribe of the Abénaquis would forsake its alliance with the French, would join our enemies, and our own women and children would share the fate of this unhappy English woman. Their blood would be upon my head.' Well, Mr. Archie, for 6 months after this hideous scene, I used to start from my sleep bathed in sweat, with those heart-rending cries of 'My God,' shrieking in my ears. They wondered at my coolness when the ice was bearing me down to the Falls of Saint Thomas. Here is the explanation of it. Through the tumult and uproar, I was hearing the screams of the unhappy English woman, and I believed that Heaven was punishing me, as I deserved, for not having succored her. For you see, Mr. Archie, that man often makes laws which God is very far from sanctioning." "True indeed," said Archie, sighing. During the rest of their journey, the 2 friends talked about the D'Habervilles. Archie learned that the ladies and Uncle Raoul, on the appearance of the English fleet in the St. Lawrence, had taken refuge within the walls of Quebec. Captain d'Haberville and Jules were in camp at Beaupré with their respective regiments. fearing lest Archie should fall in with some of the Abenaqui spies who were hanging on the skirts of the English, he escorted Archie all the way to his encampment. Archie's parting words were as follows: "You have paid me life for life, my friend. But for my part I shall never forget what I owe you. How strangely our lives have come together, Dumais. 2 years ago I came all the way from Quebec to South River just in time to snatch you from the abyss. Yesterday, having but just landed from a voyage across the ocean, I am made a prisoner, and you find yourself waiting on a little island in Trois Saumons Lake to save my honor and my life. The hand of God is in it. Farewell, dear friend. However adventurous the soldier's career, I cling to the hope that fate will bring us again together, and that I may give your children further cause to bless my memory." When the sun arose, the Highlanders remarked the strange pallor of their young chief. They concluded that, dreading a surprise, he had passed the night in wandering about the camp. After a light meal, Archie gave the order to burn the house beside the mill. He had scarcely resumed the march when a messenger came from Montgomery, ordering him to cease from the work of destruction. "It is time," cried Archie, gnawing his sword hilt. End of chapter 13.